Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to use the microphone here.
You have to have his picture up there?
And yeah, that's Adolf Hitler. He's
Yeah, I know who it
Polish.
is.
Can everybody hear me with the microphone? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Hold on. Let's see if we can raise this a little bit. Can you hear me now? Okay. So, good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner. And we're talking about the year 1944. And the reason we're talking about 1944 was yesterday was Veterans Day, which was originally called Armistice Day. November 11th, 1918, when World War I ended, about 11 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was changed to Veterans Day, but it was Armistice Day, and you probably grew up with Armistice Day. So, this is, even though it's not Veterans Day today, it's leftover, it's the next day. And I got a question for some of you. How many of you benefited from the GI Bill?
What?
The GI Bill. Your husband was in the Army, or the Navy, or the Air Force, or the Coast Guard. So some of you probably benefited from the GI Bill. 1944, I have two things that happened to me. One of them, a twist of fate. My mother-in-law became a widow in 1944, and I'm going to explain the story. Had she not become a widow, I'd have different kids, different grandkids. I'll explain that story a little later. And the other, I don't know how many of you heard of Ruth Gruber?
What's that?
Ruth Gruber. Ruth Gruber. Ruth Gruber was a photojournalist, and she saved about 900 Jews in 1944. Her story would become a made-for-TV movie called Oswego, and that was about 40 years ago. And two of my friends produced a play based on her work in 1944, saving Jews. Okay, let's get into it. Adolf Hitler needs no introduction, right? Joseph Stalin there with Winston Churchill. Oh, kamikaze planes. Kamikaze planes are in a museum outside of Washington, D.C. The kamikaze planes that they got meant that it was a failure by the Japanese. Hitler was, well, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944. Lots of propaganda, including cartoons made by Warner Brothers, and this one is called Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips. And I'll explain why you'll never see that cartoon on TV again. The 1944 GI Bill of Rights, which takes effect after World War II. Presidential election between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Thomas E. Dewey, you know, the Dewey Thruway, right outside the Thomas E. Dewey Thruway over there. Stalingrad, 1943. When Americans got into the war in 1942, or December 7th, 1941, the Americans were way behind. After all, World War II started on September 1st, 1939, and there was a lot of, excuse me, a lot of catch-up to do. And the Soviets were doing a lot of legwork. In fact, if you look at how the war turns around in Europe, it's basically on the back of the Soviet Union, 1943 in Stalingrad. The Germans marched through Europe starting on September 1st, 1939, and with Poland, and invading them, and they started to retreat and recede by 1943. Soviet Union launches a counteroffensive against the Germans at Stalingrad. That is November 1942. The Soviets quickly encircled an entire German army. More than 200,000 soldiers, 220,000 soldiers. 1943, in February, after months of fierce fighting, heavy casualties, the Germans had only 91,000 troops left. Germany is on the run. By the way, the Soviets may have lost as many as 10 million soldiers during World War II. 10 million fighting the Germans. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet army remained on the offensive, liberating most of Ukraine and virtually all of Russia and eastern Belarusia through 1943. The battle for Stalingrad proved to be a decisive psychological turning point, ending a string of German victories in the summer of 1942, and the Germans start to retreat back to Germany. It would set the stage for 1944. This is Robert Oppenheimer. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah.
Head of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project probably saved the life of the father of a friend of mine who was scheduled to go to Japan in a near-suicide mission in the fall of 1945. Of course, he is one of the fathers of the atomic bomb. On January the 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt formally authorizes the atomic bomb project. In June 1942, the U.S. Army established the Manhattan Project to handle its part in the atomic bomb project and begin the process of transferring responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. In September 1942, Lieutenant General Leslie Richard Groves Jr. was appointed to what would become known as the Manhattan Project. Groves selected J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weaponry laboratories. There was some question about whether or not how loyal Oppenheimer was to the United States, but he was a stickler and had a lot of discipline, and that's why he was chosen. In 1943, in the United States, in England, and all the other allied countries, there was some anxiety among scientists that the Germans might be making significant progress on an atomic bomb. In a letter dated May 25, 1943, Oppenheimer responded to a proposal from the physicist Enrico Fermi to use radioactive materials to poison German food supplies. But Oppenheimer had a caveat there, and there is Fermi. Oppenheimer said to Fermi, could you produce enough strontium without letting too many in on the secret? And then he said, I think we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison sufficient to kill, or we can poison, food sufficient to kill 500,000 men. He wanted to kill 500,000 men. He wanted to poison them. Well, that goes out the window. Groves and Oppenheimer continue. In July, in 1944, Oppenheimer briefly abandoned the gun design in favor of an implosion-type weapon using chemical explosive lenses. A subcritical sphere of fissure material could be squeezed into a smaller indented form. The metal needed to travel only would go a short distance, so the critical mass would be assembled in much less time. In August of 44, Oppenheimer implemented sweeping reorganization of the Los Alamos, New Mexico laboratory to focus on an implosion. He concentrated on the development efforts of the gun-type defense again, or device again, a simpler design that only had to work with uranium-235 in a single group, and this device would eventually become Little Boy. 1945, the bomb that would obliterate Hiroshima. Siege of Leningrad ends. That's me and my wife in St. Petersburg about 12 years ago. The Siege of Leningrad, called the 900-day siege, took place between September 8, 1941 and January 27. Like I said, the Soviets did all, or the Russians did a lot of the heavy lifting. Siege lasted 872 days. In January, successful Soviet offensive drove the Germans westward from the city to the outskirts, ending the siege. the Soviets were making huge strides against the Nazis. Cherbourg, France is a little museum. A lot of the staging for Normandy and D-Day took place in Cherbourg. It's not the only thing that happened in Cherbourg in 1944. One thing would have a significant impact on my life later on that year. And I wasn't born until 1956. Anyway, there's a little museum. This is a bomb that was going to be used on D-Day. Operation Overlord, code D-Day, commences with the landing of 155,000 Allied troops on the beaches of Normandy in France. Any of you have any relatives or people you knew that were on the beach in Normandy? You did?
Yeah.
Who's that?
It was a cousin.
Cousin of yours. Cousin of yours. Anybody else? I used to speak at Yogi Berra's museum.
Danny, who used to
Dan-
die, but was here.
Oh, a guy named Danny.
Danny, he was there.
He was there too. And he passed away. Right? I used to speak at Yogi Berra's museum. And before Yogi Berra was Yogi Berra, he was Lawrence Peter Berra. He was in the Navy. And we were talking about Normandy. I think he's the only Major League Baseball player that was in Normandy. I said, hey, Yogi. He said, were you afraid? Nah. He said, I'm short. They shoot the bullets high. Efforts to free France from Nazi occupation began in June with the D-Day invasion of Normandy. When the Allied troops land on the beach and start to make their way towards Paris. And this is another picture from that museum that I went to in Cherbourg. I didn't get to Normandy because it was pouring, absolutely pouring. And bad, in fact, bad weather pushed back D-Day by a couple of days. It could have been June 3rd, 1944. More Allied troops would land in southern France on August 15th, and they made their way toward the Rhine River. As the Allies made their push toward Paris, French resistance fighters began an uprising in Paris. By August 25th, the Allies and the Free French forces entered Paris, and by the end of the month, the French government is handed over to the Free French troops in Charles de Gaulle. This is Operation Bagration, named after a Soviet fighter back in the days of Napoleon. On the night of June 21st or 22nd in the early morning, Soviets launched a summer offensive in Belarus. 3 weeks to the day after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Germans had achieved total surprise, encircling millions of Russian troops and thrusting right up to Moscow and Leningrad. Operation Bagration, named for a Tsarist marshal who fought Napoleon, hit the Germans with no warning. 5 weeks, the Red Army pushes them, or advances 450 miles, driving through Minsk and pushes the Germans back to Warsaw. Nearly 20 German divisions were totally destroyed. Another 50 severely mauled. It was an even worse disaster for the Germans than Stalingrad. Concentration camps. Majdanek.
I
One
have
of
a
the-
question.
Yes.
If the Germans hadn't invaded Russia, do you think the war might have been different?
Yeah, that was their big mistake. That was one of their big mistakes, the Germans, invading Russia. Could have learned from history from Napoleon, right?
I'm sorry.
They could have learned from history from Napoleon. That was one of their big mistakes. Anyway, the first major camp to be liberated was Majdanek near Lublin, Poland in July. My grandfather's family grew up around Lublin. I'm here, you know, out of a quirk of fate because he, his sister, and his brother all went to the United States around 1912 or so. He was about 20 years old. In fact, it was he and his brother and the sister, Bertha, stayed in one of the Scandinavian countries until they brought her over. The entire family was wiped out during World War II. All of them wiped out during World War II. Surprised by the rapid Soviet advance from the east, the Germans attempted to hide evidence of mass murder by demolishing most of the camp, but parts, including the gas chambers, were left standing. Many of you read The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank. How many of you read that or are familiar with it, or maybe traveled and visited the museum in Amsterdam? In 1944, Anne Frank is arrested. She had been hiding for 2 years. On August 4th, acting on a tip from an informer, the Nazi Gestapo captures 15-year-old Anne Frank and her family in a sealed-off area of an Amsterdam warehouse. The Franks had taken shelter there in 1942 out of fear of deportation to a Nazi training concentration camp. She spent much of her time in a so-called secret annex, working on her diary. A number of Germans by 1944 had had it with Adolf Hitler. They saw the country being ruined. They saw the culture being ruined. Everything about Germany was being ruined. And a couple of them decided, you know what, time to get rid of Adolf Hitler. Hitler assassination attempt. It's July 20th. Hitler survives an assassination attempt led by German Army officer Klaus von Stauffenberg. High-ranking German officials had made up their minds that Hitler must die. He was leading Germany into a suicidal war on two fronts. And assassination is the only way to stop him. Coup d'etat would follow, and the new German government in Berlin would save Germany from complete and utter destruction at the hands of the Allies. That is Klaus von Stauffenberg. At 12:42 a.m., or p.m. rather, in the afternoon, 12:42 in the afternoon, bomb went off. When the smoke cleared, Hitler survived. He was wounded, charred, may have had temporary paralysis of one arm, but he was very much alive, to the world's chagrin. 4 others present died from their wounds. Von Stauffenberg was shot the same day. Once Hitler figured out the extent of the conspiracy, he began the systematic liquidation of his enemies. 7,000 Germans would be arrested. 5,000 would end up dead, either executed or they committed suicide.
Wow.
Quebec City. Quebec City, which is 9-10 hours from here, from a drive, ended up being a meeting place in 1943 and 1944. 1943, it was to plan the European offensive. 1944, it was to plan the utter destruction of Germany and Japan and what to do in Europe once Germany was gone. The first Quebec conference was held in August 1943. Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, William Lyon Mackenzie, the Prime Minister of Canada, and T.J. Soong, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. That's Chiang Kai-shek's China. Plans for the forthcoming Allied invasion of Italy and France were discussed. Ultimately, D-Day. And if you go up to Quebec City today, nothing has changed. Frontenac is there, the promenade is there. I guess the river has been widened, St. Lawrence Seaway, but it all looks the same when you get there except for the widening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. This was 1943. The second Quebec Conference was held in September 1944, attended by Churchill and Roosevelt. Decision was made there to advance against Germany on 2 western fronts. Additionally, there was a revised timeline to invade the Philippines, resulting in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf in October, and it would set up the struggle for Okinawa in 1995. It's the V-2 rocket. About 10 years ago, I'm doing a talk on NASA, going to the moon, and all. And there was a guy who served in Europe and around this time. And then he ended up serving Kennedy and Johnson in the White House. And he knew, he was Army. He knew a little bit about the rocket. And he said, it's a good thing they really didn't mass produce this rocket because we had no defense, we being the Allies, had no defense against it. The American scientist from Massachusetts, Robert Goddard's work in the 1920s largely anticipated in technical detail the German V-2 missiles that were being developed, including gyroscopic control, steering by means of vanes in the jet stream of the rocket motor, gimbal steering, power-driven fuel pumps, and other devices. It took 5 minutes from launch to where it was going to land. And that went from Germany into England. It was launched from mobile units. Each V-2 rocket was 46 feet high, carried a ton of explosives. First attack was on London, September 8, 1944. Created a 32-foot crater, killed 3 and injured 22. This is the aftermath of that. It's a military weapon, It took just 5 minutes from launch to landing. The V stood for Vergeltungswaffe, a retaliatory weapon. It was the last-ditch attempt by the Germans to reverse the course of the war. They were losing the war. Or as Mel Brooks said in The Producer, we're losing the war. How many of you watched Mel Brooks, The Producers? He actually fought in Europe. He was like 18 years old then. The prisoners were mainly pulled from concentration camps for their technical skills, such as welding. The Germans figured out, well, we could use some of the Jews for this, and the other Jews that are incapable of working, we'll just gas them and get rid of them. That started in 1942. So they worked around the clock, underground factory called Mittelwerk near the Buchenwald concentration camp, central Germany. Look, they lived under appalling conditions in the concentration camp. It was just as bad here. Little daylight, no daylight, little sleep, little food, or proper sanitation. But the Germans had a sabotage problem. Now wait a minute. How could you have a sabotage problem with this weapon if these people are just being taken out of the concentration camps and working on it, and you're watching them all the time? So how do you have a sabotage problem? Well, it's simple. Many were executed for attempting sabotage. Eyewitness accounts describe prisoners being hanged from cranes above the rocket assembly lines. Sabotage? You know how they sabotaged the rockets? They urinated on them. They urinated on them. They urinated on the machines. And that caused all kinds of problems. Oh, this guy here, second from the right, is Wernher von Braun, the father of the United States space program. But in 1938, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, into 45, he is the chief scientist for the Nazis. It's complicated. Wernher von Braun joined the Nazi Party November 12, 1937. His family was very politically connected. In other ways, they were very connected as well. He claimed he was coerced by the SS. It's been documented that von Braun didn't really want his research used for military purposes. He even stated he was coerced into working with the Nazi Party. Well, you judge whether he was coerced or not, because the only guy who's not in the military uniform in that picture is Wernher von Braun. And the guy who is shaking the hand of the guys behind him in front of von Braun is Himmler, Heinrich Himmler. So you judge for yourself. Was von Braun coerced, or is he working with the Nazis? He was the engineer, designed the V-2. The Allies realized the V-2 was a machine unlike anything they ever developed themselves. Ruthie Gruber. I asked people around here, did you ever hear of Ruth Gruber? She lived to 105 years old. She lived in Riverdale. She was a photojournalist. So anybody ever hear the story of Ruth Gruber? I didn't know her. My friends Bob Block and Bill Goldstein were good friends of her, and eventually would produce a play about her. Anyway, there's Ruth Gruber right there. On August 5th, buses holding about 1,000, mostly Jewish immigrants or refugees, from Europe pulled to the entrance of Oswego, New York's Fort Ontario, a military outpost that was established during the Revolutionary War. They were chosen from 3,000 applicants throughout Italy who heard of the rescue plan through the work of Ruth Gruber. She was the Assistant Secretary to the Interior, Howard Ickes. Gruber was sent to Italy as a representative of the newly established War Refugee Board. And she was there to vet and escort a group of refugees to the United States. And there she is, Ruth Gruber. When they landed in upstate New York, Gruber accompanied them and their families by a train to Oswego. After the war, it was Gruber who once again advocated for the residents to be allowed U.S. citizenship. The U.S. was going to throw them out as soon as the war was over, giving them the opportunity to stay in the country if they desired. Because of her efforts and the power of persuasion, Safe Haven was the only shelter in the U.S. for Jewish refugees during World War II. And Bob and Bill, and I'll tell you a little more about Bob and Bill's play, which was called Haven. It's called Haven. Well, the turnaround battle is in the Gulf of Leyte in the Philippines. And the kamikazes are going to be coming out, except there are kamikaze planes there, which means that they kind of failed in their mission. Kamikaze was supposed to kill himself, right? Suicide mission. But there are some planes there. The battle takes place during the month of October. It takes place between October 23rd and 26th, considered one of the largest naval battles in world history. The United States, Australia, Filipino forces, Filipino citizens were American citizens, began the invasion of Japan, or the Japanese-occupied Philippines by landing in the Gulf. The Japanese suffered heavy losses to their navy. Marked the first time that kamikaze aerial attacks took place. The Allies won the battle, and it would lead to the liberation of the Philippines. And this was a turning point in the war because it cut off the supply route in Southeast Asia for the Japanese. Absolutely devastating loss for them. They lost thousands and they lost a lot of ships. The Battle of the Bulge. Anybody in here have a relative or knew somebody in the Battle of the Bulge? You did?
I know someone did.
Oh, okay. I'm sure somebody here had somebody who was connected with the Battle of the Bulge at some point. That starts in Belgium. And it's Adolf Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. He wants to split the Allies as they're driving to Germany. The German troops' failure to divide Britain, France, and America paved the way for victory for the Allies and eventually moving into Germany. It lasts about 6 weeks. December 16th, 1944 to January 25th, 1945. It's the beginning of the end for Germany. But Germany surprised the Americans and the Allies at the outset. And then they get a hold of General Anthony McAuliffe, the 101 Airborne Division, and say, we beat you, how about a surrender? And well, McAuliffe had a 4-letter response. Began with that, nuts, nuts. Many of you heard the story about the Leopoldville. It's a ship. It sank Christmas Eve, 1944. It would impact my life. I was born 11 and a half years later. I had no idea that it would impact my life, but it did. So I'm going to tell you the story about the Leopoldville and about how it impacted me. Fate. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the Belgian troop ship Leopoldville left the pier at Southampton, England, with over 2,000 American soldiers assigned to the 66th Infantry Division, and it crossed the English Channel into France. 5.5 miles away from its destination, the shoreboard, the Leopoldville, was torpedoed and sunk by the German submarine U-486. There were 763 American soldiers killed. The bodies of 493 never recovered from the channel's frigid 68-degree waters. What exactly happened was covered up for decades, 50 years. The woman in the middle here is my mother-in-law. Her husband, George Kessler, was on that ship. Took nearly an hour for Cherbourg, people in Cherbourg, to realize that the Leopoldville was sinking. Several hundred Allied vessels in the harbor at Cherbourg might have served as a rescue craft, but all had cold engines, because many of the crewmen were ashore celebrating Christmas Eve, getting drunk. It's my wife. Cherbourg. That's where we were. And her mother lost her husband with a kid on the way. Now, of course, if that never happens, she's never born. I have to meet somebody else. I have different kids and different grandkids. So what happened with the Leopoldville, something that I'm kind of interested in. Something that my kids are kind of interested in. Allied forces were enjoying their Christmas dinner in Cherbourg, and they failed to mobilize a rescue effort before the Leopold sank by the stern at 20:40 or 8:40 in the evening. 8:40 in the evening. This is not 11 o'clock. This is 20 to 9. Belated efforts by ships, including the USS PC-1225, rescued some of the survivors. My mother-in-law's husband, George Kessler, was not one of the survivors. News of the sinking 5 miles off the French coast was censored. It took decades before many families learned how their sons died. British documents about the incident remained classified until 1995, when some journalists started poking around and asked what really happened to Leopoldville. Because the story was out there. The men on the ship who survived told the story to other people, but it was never officially told by the British government, nor has it ever been told by the American government. 802 men died, including George Kessler, Blanche's husband, with a kid on the way. Life changed. I'm not even born and my life has changed, right? Think of that. I'm not even born. I'm like not even a glint. And my mother had me when I was 21, so she was 10 years old. My father was 12 at the time. So funny how life throws curves at you that you don't even know about. And I never knew about it until the story came out around 1995. The story of the Leopold. I knew that George was killed. I did not know how he was killed. Glenn Miller disappears. How many of you remember In the Mood? Glenn Miller. He was as big as Elvis. He was as big as the Beatles. He was huge. He was absolutely huge. The band manager, his band manager, Don Haynes, was the last one to see Major Glenn Miller alive on the ground. Without permission from his chain of command, Miller took his manager's place on December 15th, a flight from Twinwood Farm Airfield to Paris, France, to arrange for the band's appearance. The plane never reached France and was never found. Miller's disappearance was not publicized until Christmas Eve, when the Associated Press announced that Miller would not be conducting the scheduled BBC broadcast AEF Christmas show the following day. Now, this may get somebody upset here, but that's okay. How many of you like John Wayne? Okay, how many of you were like my father, who adored the ground that John Wayne walked on? No? No? Good, good. Because John Wayne, the fake war hero, never served. But he was the tough guy, right? He was the real tough guy in the movies. John Wayne was a fake war hero. Was a guy who played with the New York Yankees. His name was Jerry Coleman. He was also a New York Yankees announcer and the San Diego Padres announcer. I was in sports for many years, and I got to know Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Coleman. I used to see Jerry Coleman. I would go like that. He said, "Get out of here, stop that, stop that, stop that." But he was a Korean war hero, and he was telling me the stories of Ted Williams, who he served with in Korea. Ted Williams was the great baseball player with the Boston Red Sox and quite a pilot, apparently, both in World War II and the Korean police action. Jerry once told me that Ted Williams was everything John Wayne wanted or portrayed to be on film. You know, Jerry Coleman wasn't the only veteran who had a very low opinion of John Wayne. John Wayne was on his way to becoming a big star thanks to the help from the director from Portland, Maine, John Ford. But Wayne decides he's not going to get involved in World War II, unlike General Jimmy Stewart. Remember Jimmy Stewart? He was a general. Or Paul Newman, or Clark Gable, or others. No. This is John Ford. And this is a statue of him in Portland, Maine, I should say. I was there 3 times. Twice it rained, and this was the only good day where it didn't rain in Portland. John was now a commander in the U.S. Navy. And he told John Wayne what he thought about him, how the Duke, where's your service to the country? Where's your service to the country? Ford would frequently berate Wayne to get into it. He's growing rich as other men are dying. John Wayne was the fake war hero. According to the author, Gary Willis, 1998 book, John Wayne's America, The Politics of Celebrity, the actor received a chorus of boos when he walked onto USO stages in Australia and the Pacific Islands. Those audiences were filled with combat veterans, people who saw action, who were there when the bullets were flying. Wayne was in his mid-30s, and he was not one of them. Now, I don't think anybody in here has ever heard of Private Snafu. Have you? Yeah, you're laughing. You've heard of Private Snafu? By the way, what does snafu stand for? Do you know? S-N-A-F-U? Snafu?
Getting caught up in something.
But actually, a woman yesterday. A woman yesterday said she spelled it out, and everybody's like, huh? I said, I'll be more politically correct. Snafu, situation normal, all fouled up. But they used a different 6-letter word for F for snafu in the army. So anyway, so yeah, the woman said it out loud, and everybody was. So and she wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't embarrassed. It was okay. The director, Frank Capra. It's a Wonderful World, a Life, right? Frank Capra, Wonderful Life. Anyway, he's the chairman of the U.S. Army Forces First Motion Picture Unit, and he comes up with the title character, Private Snafu, a bumbling recruit who does everything wrong. To the GI audience, Snafu was also a military slang acronym. Situation normal, all, put your F word in there, all fouled up, or a version of that. Anyway, oh, by the way, do you know who was writing Private Snafu cartoons? Theodore Geisel, who you might know better as Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, how many of your kids and grandkids grew up reading Dr. Seuss? I have granddaughters now. Hop on Pop is one of my 3-year-old granddaughter's favorite books, Hop on Pop. And there is a Dr. Seuss museum somewhere in Massachusetts. Anyway, he drew this cartoon, Hitler and Tojo, Liberators of America, right? You know, like Mount Rushmore. Don't let them carved those faces on our mountains, buy United States bonds and stamps. Private Snafu. Most of the 4-minute shorts were written by Theodore Dr. Seuss Geisel, voiced by Mel Blanc, who was already famous for his vocalization of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and others. Private Snafu was produced by Warner Brothers Studios, and most were directed by the animation industry giants Chuck Jones and Fritz Freeland. The cartoons were for military use only. They were never to be seen by civilians, but you could see them today. They were considered classified. One of the cartoons, Fake News in World War II. Fake News in World War II. And basically this cartoon is Snafu hears a rumor and passes it on to others, passes it on to others, others and others, and it's fake news. It was never there. And basically it was done to illustrate that if you hear a rumor, you know, loose lips sink ships, don't say anything. And here is Snafu, right there. Private Snafu episodes feature titles like Gripes, Spies, The Goldbrick, Censored, Private Snafu versus Malaria Mike, who was getting in trouble. And one of my favorite titles, Booby Traps. Do you know what booby traps were? Want to guess? Women.
Women?
Women. Booby traps.
Catch you unaware.
Yeah. Yeah, booby traps. Private Snafu was extremely popular with the GI audience. Episodes addressed soldiers' gripes with sympathetic ear while simultaneously stressing the importance discipline plays in the military establishment. Again, you know, we talked about temptation. Daffy Duck, Hitler, the Hitler spy, the temptress. And cartoons were like that. At the end, Daffy Duck would hit Hitler over the head with a mallet. Now, war propaganda cartoons. The Weekly Reporter, a Warner Brothers cartoon released on March 25th, directed by Chuck Jones, written by Michael Maltese, who grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and the music directed by Carl Stalling. The cartoon's a spoof of sacrifices made by those on the home front during World War II. Then there's another cartoon, Fritz Freeling's Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, produced by Warner Brothers Animation, a war propaganda cartoon in which Bugs Bunny fights the Imperial Japanese Army. Today, that cartoon is considered too politically incorrect to see. You should show it. Part of the wartime propaganda, but you're not going to see it. Warner Brothers refuses to put it out. Put it out in a special set, wartime propaganda. Haven't done it. We went the wrong way. Jack King's Donald Duck, short, Commander Duck, premieres a wartime propaganda cartoon produced by Walt Disney Company in which Donald fights Japanese soldiers. Frank Tashland's wartime propaganda cartoon Plain Daffy, Daffy Duck, is first released, produced by Warner Brothers Cartoons, in which Daffy fights a female Nazi spy. You saw what she looked like. She was real curvy. And fools Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring. How many of you like Mel Brooks? Yeah, well, he's still around. He's 97 years old. He's still around, Mel Brooks. He's still working, too, believe it or not. Anyway, if you ever saw The Producers on Broadway, there's a dance scene where Franklin Roosevelt takes on Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. And that was a cartoon. He lifted it out of a cartoon called Gremlin from the Kremlin. That's where it came from. That's where it came. A lot of Mel Brooks stuff comes from Warner Brothers cartoons. Merry Melodies, Russian Rhapsody. Hitler flies a bomber to attack the Soviet Union, but is met by gremlins. Gremlins from the Kremlin. About 40 wartime movies were made. The U.S. Office of War Information had a unit dedicated exclusively to Hollywood and the Bureau of Motion Pictures. And the Japanese got into it as well. They assumed control of Santo Tomas in the Philippines, Manila, and they had carefully staged propaganda photographs of some of the prisoners to be shown how well they were treated. The prisoners, though, including children, were made to bow to officers and were beaten. They failed to go low enough. Food and supplies from friends outside the camp were cut off. There was no more meat, just rice and dried fish. And the Germans did the same thing, propping up their Hitler and his people. German propaganda supported the efforts of the murderous Nazi regime, even attempting to portray in a positive light the horrors of concentration camps. It sounds like, hey, why don't you come here and buy a house? Just listen to this. The Fuhrer gives a city to the Jews, produced in Theresienstadt, a model ghetto established by the Nazis in the former Czechoslovakia. Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels intended the film to prove that Jews were being well treated in the camps. Well treated. Now, I brought up this question before. How many of you benefited from the GI Bill of Rights? Husbands who were able to go to college, able to get loans for houses, or maybe a brother or an uncle who was in the military who benefited from the GI Bill. I know I did. My father in the mid-50s was in the Army, and he got a GI loan in 1968 to move to Rockland County. Franklin Roosevelt began talking about, we got to do something about the veterans. They're putting their lives on the line every day for us, and we better do something. And he starts talking about it on July 28, 1943. He and his advisors lay out plans for the return to civilian life of the gallant men and women. Remember, there were WACs, there were waves in the armed forces. He argued that the veterans would be entitled to definite action to help take care of their special problems. On October 27, 1943, he takes the idea, makes a proposal, asking Congress to enact legislation that would finance 1 year of education or vocational training for all those who served in World War II. As the GI Bill made its way through House and Senate committees, the unemployment assistance, education, and training provisions came under fire. See, the Republicans don't like big government. Don't like it today, didn't like it back then. But they were, they talk about, well, let's take care of the veterans. Well, they didn't really want to take care of these guys who literally put their lives on the line every day. Every day they were in harm's way. Republicans worried that the bill would lead to further expansion of the federal government. GI Bill would be signed eventually. On March 24th, the Senate passed the GI Bill unanimously. The House passed it on May 18th. On June 7th, the bill was done, sent up to Roosevelt, who signed it on June 22nd. The bill provided for college education loans for GIs wanting to own a home or open a business or just go to college. The Army was segregated. The Navy was segregated. The U.S. Air Force was segregated. The desegregation came inadvertently during the Battle of the Bulge when Dwight Eisenhower needed more troops, and he dipped into the Negro part of the military. And Negroes were in charge of things like cars and engines and things of that nature, hardly ever fought. But every available man, every available woman was needed. America's Joe Louis versus the Axis, the Negro soldier. It's a 1944 documentary created by the United States Army during World War II, produced by Capra, as a follow-up to his successful film series, Why We Fight. The Army used the film as propaganda to convince black Americans to enlist in the Army, fight in the war. The Negro Soldier provided to be a breakout film, influencing Army members and civilians of all races. How many of you heard of Rosa Parks? Rosa Parks, right? Of course. But she, long before there was Rosa Parks, not giving up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, on the bus in December 1955, this woman, Irene Morgan. Irene Morgan, in 1944, was having a baby. She had a miscarriage. Her doctor was in Baltimore. She was in Virginia. The case begins on July 16, 1944, when Irene Morgan boarded a Greyhound bus in Virginia for a 5-hour bus ride to see her doctor. She sat in the colored section. When a young white couple boarded the crowded bus and needed seats, the white driver told Morgan, "Surrender your seat." She refused. The driver drove her to jail. Sheriff's deputy came aboard, handed Morgan an arrest warrant. She tore it up, threw it outside the bus window. When one of the officers swore at her and tried to physically remove her from the bus, she kicked him. She would eventually sue. It's a cliffhanger here. You're going to have to wait to the end to find out what happened to Irene Morgan. You don't have to wait to find out what happened to this guy, George Stinney. George Stinney, Jim Crow South, March 23rd, South Carolina. 2 white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Lineker, 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were found dead. They failed to return home the night before. Police arrested George Stinney, then 14, and his older brother Johnny. For the murders, Johnny was released, but George was held in charge with the murders. His trial was by an all-white jury. Lasted 1 day. Barely lasted an hour. He was found guilty. He had not been allowed to see his family before the trial. He was questioned alone without an attorney. During the trial, Stinney's defense offered no cross-examination, didn't call any witnesses, and offered virtually no defense. The jury deliberated about 10 minutes before he was found guilty and sentenced to death. The Jim Crow South. He is not very big. It's rather small. He was executed shortly thereafter. June 16th, he was so small compared to the adults that prisoners that prison staff had difficulty securing him to the electrodes. It took 83 days between the crime and his death. And he was the youngest American ever to be sentenced to death for the killing of 2 people who he might not have done. The New York Yankees, the New York Giants, and the Brooklyn Dodgers had a rather unusual game in June on the 26th of 1944. It really wasn't a real game. It was to get people out to the stadium to buy war bonds. The 3 New York City Major League Baseball teams, the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants, played a unique 6-inning game for war bonds. The final score, the Dodgers 5, the Yankees 1, the Giants nothing. At this point in the war, buying war bonds was a normal pitch. Normal, and things happen out of the, away from the usual. America's at war. U.S. Treasury needed to come up with lots of money fast to meet the expanding financial demands. President Roosevelt settled on 2 major means of raising money: increasing taxes and borrowing, and through the use of war bonds. You will not ever see this on TV again because it's censored. Any bonds today? There's Porky Pig, Elmer Fudd, that drawing of Elmer Fudd, and Bugs Bunny. Now, the reason you will not see it today was because the animators drew Bugs Bunny in blackface, pretending to be Al Jolson. Instead of singing Mammy, singing Sammy. Again, I don't agree with just censoring this. I think you should put it out there. America's at war. And America had a problem with blackface entertainment as well. It was normal. It was part of normal entertainment, and it should be explained in that context. Irving Berlin wrote the song "Any Bonds Today." It became the theme song of the Treasury Department's National Defense Savings Program. There was rationing. I don't know how many of you remember rationing. You do. Did you get your candy? Did you get candy?
We didn't eat candy anyway, but you get sugar and.
Sugar and all that stuff. So there is rationing, and you had the rationing book. And the United States limited the amount of goods, certain goods, that a person could get. Gasoline, butter, sugar, canned milk, all needed for the war effort. Along with shoes.
Shoes?
Shoes. They ration shoes. Your feet might grow. You might have a growth spurt. That's your problem. They ration shoes. The war also disrupted trade, limiting availability of some goods. The Japanese Imperial Army controlled the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia, from March 1942 to September 1945, and that created a shortage of rubber that affected American production. And there is somebody going to a grocery store, talking to the proprietor, and handing him her rationing card, or rationing book. And he just checks off what she has. Americans received their first rationing cards in May of 1942. The first card, War Rationing Card number 1, became known as the Sugar Book. For one of the commodities Americans could purchase was sugar with their rationing card. Other rationing cards developed as the war progressed. Rationing cards included stamps of drawings of airplanes, guns, tanks, ears of wheat, and fruit, and they were used to purchase related items. Bugs Bunny is in the rationing game. This is all about the gremlin, throwing all kind of monkey wrenches into Bugs, who's all of a sudden piloting one of the United States military aircraft, and Bugs doesn't know what he's doing, and the craft is going down, spinning out of control, about going to hit the ground. Except, runs out of gas. The gremlin and Bugs are there, plane's about that far from the ground, and Bugs says, you know how it is with these A cards. Ran out of gas. The Office of Pricing Administration rationed automobiles, tires, gasoline, fuel oil, coal, firewood, nylon, silk, and shoes. Americans used their ration cards and stamps to take a meager share of household staples, including meat, dairy, coffee, dried fruits, jams, jellies, lard, shortening, and oils. Meat came off the list in 1944. I don't know how many of you remember blackouts, but there were blackout drills, and you had the blackout curtains. Now, the Germans more than likely didn't have planes that were going to get to the United States, and one of the reasons the United States was able to be so isolated is because of the two oceans. Blackout, this has to be in winter, 5 a.m. till dawn daily. Officials in some American coastal cities were well aware of their vulnerability to air attacks, began ordering practice blackouts before December 7th, 1941's bombing of Pearl Harbor. On March 8th, 1941, Seattle became the first major city to test its blackout procedures. Anybody related to Rosie the Riveter? Anybody have a mother or a grandmother who worked in a munitions factory? Nobody? Nobody? Rosie the Riveter started a campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for the defense industries during World War II, and she became perhaps the most iconic image of working women. So much so that when women wanted some more rights in the early part of the 20th century, 21st century, 2001, 2002, they revived Rosie the Riveter. She was back. American women entered the workforce during the war. The men were gone, and the workforce was 37% American women during the war, and 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. And that is Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter. And who is this? Is it Rosie or is it Naomi? Well, who was Rosie? Naomi Parker Fralin is photographed in the machine shop at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, outside of Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco. She could be Rosie. That was a 1942 picture of her with the bandana. But nobody knows for certain. Women were only supposed to work during the war. After the war, the men come home, women go home, and basically they're supposed to make babies and keep house. Well, that was the thought. Wasn't necessarily the case. Thomas Dewey ran as a Republican against Franklin Roosevelt in the 1944 presidential election. Roosevelt won his third term, an unprecedented third term in 1940, decided to run again for the 1944 Democratic nominee, as the Democratic nominee, or tried to get the nomination in 1944. Concerned that Roosevelt's ill health would mean that the vice president would likely become president of the Democratic Convention, dropped Roosevelt's vice president, Henry A. Wallace, in favor of the Missouri Senator, Harry S. Truman. Thomas Dewey of New York, the governor, who has the thruway named after him these days, and he's got the house is still there up in Pauling, which would have been the summer White House in Pauling, and he won. He gets the nomination, or will certainly get the nomination after he defeated the conservative governor, John W. Bricker, at the 1944 National Convention because of his victory in the primary in Wisconsin. I want you, Uncle Sam, finish the job. That was one of FDR's campaign posters. The Republicans campaigned against the New Deal. The Republicans have campaigned against the New Deal in every presidential election since 1940. So they continue to campaign against the New Deal, and young people don't want to hear about it anymore.
Wow.
Anyway, but you know, they wanted smaller government, a less regulated economy, which is what their plank still is, as the war seemed to be an end of the war in sight. Roosevelt's popularity was the main theme of the campaign. To quiet rumors that he was in poor health, he went out in October and campaigned, driving through cities in open cars. The chief issue was the war, but Dewey took shots at Roosevelt's health. He declared that the administration was dominated by tired and quarrelsome old men. He challenged chiefly the management of the federal government and reiterated that it was time for a change. America First Party. There are a couple editions of the America First Party, or America First, which went out of business 1941. John Kennedy was part of it, Joe Kennedy was part of it, and it was basically Americans should stay isolationists, stay out of Europe's affairs. Charles Lindbergh was also part of it as well. Anyway.
Lindbergh was a Nazi.
Lindbergh was what he was. Anyway, the America First Party. September 8th, 1944. At the America First Party's convention in Detroit, the party nominated Gerald L.K. Smith, the founder of the racist and anti-Semitic Christian National Crusade, as its presidential candidate. A proposal for the deportation of American Jews to a late designated area within the next 5 years, and the sterilization of those who remained in America after that period was prepared for presentation to the America's First Party's convention, but withdrawn at the last moment. The plank was submitted for the party, platformed by former Silver Shirter Homer Meritz. The Silver Shirters were a fascist organization fashioned after Hitler's brown shirts. Smith got 1,000 votes. There were 1,000 Americans who voted for him in 1944. The presidential election, Roosevelt wins, Truman's the vice president. Roosevelt wins by about 3.6 million votes, gets 432 electoral votes. Dewey gets 99. Dewey would win 12 states: Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Nebraska, North Dakota, Iowa, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Doesn't do anything in New York. He's the governor. But then again, Roosevelt is a New Yorker. Captain America makes its debut. Captain America. On February 5th, it was a serial film that was in the movies. The Saturday morning feature starred Dick Purcell. First appearance of a Marvel superhero out of the Marvel superhero comics in film. He does not go into the war. His thing is other things. He does not do anything in World War II. Rationing of football players. The National Football League put together or allowed the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Chicago Cardinals to merge for the 1944 season. And the reason for that was couldn't get players. Weren't enough players around, good players. If you were in, say, Philadelphia or in Chicago, where there were naval stations, you could get players. They could play for you on the weekends. Pittsburgh had no naval, no Air Force, no Army stationed nearby. They couldn't get players, so they decided to combine teams with Chicago. The team went 0-10 on the season. They did not win any games, and there they are. Rationing of players. The late Dan Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers talked about that team. He said, then the Cardinals, that was a disaster. We have 4 coaches. None of them was named head coach. Rationing. So the old story is who's the head coach? They were 0-10. But the reason for that was the war. It was not only was it difficult to get guys who were gone, but where you could have a good team was where you had a military operation, and both in Chicago and Philadelphia. And a lot of Navy people, because of being on the water, that was the reason they were able to get players, and that's the reason we combined with them. Rationing. The guy on the right here is Joe Nuxhall. I knew Joe Nuxhall. He pitched with the Cincinnati Reds, Kansas City A's. He was a longtime broadcaster with the Cincinnati Reds, where I got to know him. Any baseball fans in here? No baseball? Oh, you are? I'll give you a Joe Nuxhall joke. It's Pete Rose. Yeah, you've heard of Pete Rose, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, he's thrown out of baseball for a bit. And Pete's not the brightest bulb in the world. So we're talking one day. He said, we're staying at the Grand Hyatt. He said, yeah. He said, it's all escalators at the Grand Hyatt on the lower floors. It's still all escalators. And he said, it's a good thing that we've never had a power outage in New York while we've been there. Because if Pete was on the escalator, he wouldn't know if he should go up or down. Joe Nuxhall was 15. He didn't dream of someday pitching in the big leagues. But he was 15 when he pitched in Major League Baseball. 15 years, 10 months, 11 days, to be exact. And here he is facing junior high school kids the week before. And the next week, he's facing Seaman First Class Stan Musial. And he talked about that. 2 weeks prior to that, I was pitching against 12, 13, 14-year-old kids in junior high school. Now, all of a sudden, I'm facing Stan Musial. I'm right out there, 60 feet, 6 inches away, trying to get someone out. Musial was called to the Navy in June of '44. Nuxhall was 15. He hung around because they needed him to play football as soon as the high school season started. It was the Second World War, and they were looking for whatever might be available, and I just happened to be a big kid at 15 who could throw hard. They were looking for anyone who might have the ability, and I happen to have a little at my age. They were trying to sign his father, Orville, who was 37. He didn't impress him. The kid did. He went on to play high school football. The legacy of 1944. FDR died April 12, 1945. Truman became president. He knew nothing about the Manhattan Project. Winston Churchill was kicked out as English Prime Minister, July 1945. Stalin continued, had the atomic bomb by 1949. Hitler apparently committed suicide April 1945. Germany would fall by May 8, 1945. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945, and Japan surrendered to the United States on September 2nd, 1943. You will never see this on TV, nor in DVD. That's Bugs Bunny in blackface. At the end of World War II, January 3rd, 1946, the last proceeds from the Victory War bond campaign were deposited into the U.S. Treasury. More than 85 million Americans, half the population, bought bonds. $185.7 billion worth of bonds. Multiply that by more than 30 now, and you get more than $240 trillion or something like that. The mass selling efforts helped finance the war, and it has never been matched. Any bonds today? That cartoon has been pulled out of circulation because Bugs Bunny appears in blackface imitating Al Jolson. Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips has been pulled out of circulation because of slurs against the people of Japan. Captain America character has been featured in other films and television series for decades. More 1944 legacy, Wernher von Braun, where is Wernher? Right there. The head of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Ever wonder what happened to all the old Nazis? Because only 24 of them were tried in Nuremberg. When the war ended, the Americans, Soviets, and British scrambled to get their hands on V-2 technology. Wernher von Braun made the decision to surrender to the Americans while the Russians got their hands on the V-2 factory and test range. Operation Paperclip was an opportunity for the United States to utilize the mind power of some of the most brilliant minds that worked in Germany during World War II. More than 1,600 Nazi German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from Germany and placed in America. That's more than escaped to Argentina. That was about 10,000. The legacy, there's Wernher von Braun. The Cold War started in 1946. The democratic, capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union against one another. Each sought to prove their superiority, whether it was in military, whether it was in economics, or in space. For 15 years after World War II, von Braun worked with the U.S. Army in developing ballistic missiles. As part of the military project Paperclip, he and an initial group of about 125 Nazis were sent to Fort Bliss, Texas. They worked on rockets for the U.S. Army and assisted in V-2 launches at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. That is Irene Morgan. Irene Morgan got a medal from Bill Clinton. Thurgood Marshall in the NAACP took up the Irene Morgan case in 1946. The Supreme Court, in its ruling, stated, "It seems clear to us that seating arrangements for different races in interstate motor travel require a single uniform rule to promote and protect national travel. Consequently, we hold the Virginia statute in controversially invalid." It was never applied, which is why in 1953 you had a Little Rock bus strike, and in 1955 4 women refused to give up seats in Montgomery, Alabama. Only one of them is famous, Rosa Parks, but Irene Morgan came before her. She was a civil rights pioneer. She received the Presidential Citizens Medal, second highest civilian award in the country. She died August 10, 2007. In 2004, the George Stinney case was reopened. 2014, the conviction against him was vacated. The court did not give him a fair trial. This is Bob Block. It's my friend Frank Carney, who was with cable TV industry. Bob Block put out a play called Haven. Remember Ruth Gruber, Haven? I'm going to tell you the rest of the story now in a minute. On December 22nd, 1945, Harry Truman issued a directive that allowed the Oswego refugees to stay in the United States. Bob Block, Bill Goldstein produced a play called Oswego about Ruth Gruber.
My brother-in-law, Bob Block.
It's probably a different Bob Block. Part of the reason you never saw it around here is my fault. The play was shown in Israel. It was shown in Los Angeles. I was responsible for finding a 99-seat theater for these guys. And my expertise was not finding a 99-seat theater. I did know people who could do that. They never found a 99-seat theater in the New York area. Had they done that, this play would have been on off-Broadway. But I'm not the guy that should have asked. I said, hey, find us a 99-seat theater. I said, I'm a journalist. You can do it. I didn't. Gerber was also a journalist. She was a photojournalist and a lecturer who died in 2016. She was 105. She was still giving talks at the age of 102. 1944 Legacy, Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl. 1947, The Diary of Anne Frank was published by her father Otto in the original Dutch. It became a bestseller. It's been translated into 70 languages. And the Anne Frank Museum opened in Amsterdam in 1960. And there's my old buddy Joe Nuxall, all 15 years old of him. I knew him when he was a lot older. He returned to the major leagues with Cincinnati in 1952. He was an old man by that point. He was 23 years old. And he enjoyed a long career as a pitcher, pinch hitter, and then a broadcaster for the Cincinnati Reds. Dan Rooney's Pittsburgh Steelers, carpet. And the year before, they were the Steagles. They combined with Philadelphia. His National Football League franchise is worth billions of dollars today. They won 4 Super Bowls in the 1970s. The franchise is considered a model business. Well, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Go ahead. It's your turn to talk. Your turn to talk. Anybody?